All right, folks, let's talk a bit about political prosecutions. Obviously, something that's been in the press a ton lately in light of recent developments. What's a political prosecution? Political prosecution is a prosecution that is on some level motivated by politics, right? Somebody that is alleging a political prosecution isn't alleging that the person is innocent, right? Not guilty of the offenses charged, isn't alleging that the crimes weren't committed, but is simply alleging that the motive for the prosecution is based in part or in whole on politics, right? And let's start with the overarching idea that nobody will ever know in any political prosecution or in any non-political prosecution whether or not the prosecution was in fact political, right? Because the internal processes of prosecutors' offices, right, the internal charging decisions that are made are typically not disclosed to the public. And the prosecutor has the right to do that. So the logic and the theory behind the prosecution is more often than not, almost always, never known to the general public, even the defense sometimes, right, to the courts. Typically, that information isn't made available. Now, with a political prosecution, the main question, right, and this is the case for many questions in criminal justice. If the person being charged with a crime is guilty, if the person committed the crimes of which that person is accused, then who cares? Who cares why that person is being prosecuted? Who cares about the motives behind the prosecution? Who cares about the reasons, right? Justice is being served because somebody who committed a crime is being held to account. And as a result of that, it doesn't really matter why that person is being held to account. And that's one way of looking at it. I get that, right? That's understandable. People want, the general public wants folks to be held accountable for criminal conduct, right? That's how our system of government works. That's how our civil society operates, right? We find comfort in the fact that when somebody commits a crime, they are held responsible. They must pay the price. They must be punished for that crime. Now, the problem with that is that by definition, right, nobody would deny that everybody who commits a crime isn't prosecuted, right? Not every single crime is prosecuted for a variety of reasons. Not every single person who commits a crime is prosecuted for a variety of reasons. The biggest reason, obviously, is resources, right? The government, any prosecutor's office, whether that be a federal or a state prosecutor's office, a local prosecutor's office, doesn't have the resources, the wherewithal, the ability to find every single person who commits every single crime, right? That would be a big ask. It's a real practical impossibility, right? It can't happen. So prosecutors have to decide how they find people who committed crimes and how they prosecute people who committed crimes or who they think committed crimes. And how did they do that? They employ something called prosecutorial discretion. All right. The two most important words in our justice system, prosecutorial discretion, right? The idea that prosecutors have the right to choose who they prosecute, how they prosecute, what they charge with, what plea deals they offer, right? Prosecutors have that right. And that right is based purely on judgment, purely on subjective opinion, really. And prosecutors virtually always have very little oversight, have unlimited resources. Some folks may claim they're benefiting from a presumption of guilt, right, rather than the presumption of innocence, to which the defendant is entitled by law. And so prosecutors have to choose, right? How do they choose? Well, we'd like to think that they choose based on justice, based on protecting the victim, based on public safety, based on the desire to protect folks from danger, right? That's what we want prosecutors to do. We want them to make sure that they prosecute people that can hurt others in one way or another. And we rely on them to make decisions based on that. Now, if that prosecutorial discretion, if that judgment is exercised, even in part, based on politics, that's the fear, right? Because now you open up a can of worms, and now you allow that subjective decision-making to fall in line with a political ideology. And that becomes dangerous, right? That is what we fear. That is what we see on TV when third world countries and other countries that are governed by totalitarian regimes and dictatorships, right? Folks that prosecute others who do not agree with them. We in the United States are deathly afraid of that. We founded the United States based on the idea that the system of justice is supposed to be impartial, right? Justice is blind, it is unbiased, and the potential for a political prosecution as a result scares people. And I get that. Now, what can folks do to prove a political prosecution? Well, within the confines of the law, right, we're obviously talking about legal efforts, right? Motions and other applications made in court to try to dismiss a case, to try to limit a prosecution, restrict the prosecution in some way, because the person being prosecuted will claim that the person being prosecuted is prosecuted politically. Now, very many criminal defendants come into my office and think the prosecution is unfair, think they're being singled out, think they are being attacked, right, for improper purposes, think that prosecutors hate them, think that police hate them. And very many like to make that application in court, go to the judge and tell the judge that all of this is happening, right? And then maybe the judge will see my side of the story and will throw out this case or admonish the prosecutors or do something else that is favorable to me. Now, the legal mechanism by which that is done is called selective prosecution. Selective prosecution is a doctrine that allows for prosecutions essentially to be dismissed, criminal cases to be dismissed, if a defendant can show that the prosecution is in some way improper, if the person being prosecuted is being prosecuted for the wrong reasons. Now, obviously, as you can imagine, the standard to prove that is very, very high, right? And that is because every criminal defendant, or many criminal defendants, seek to use that tool. And so if you allow the standard to go beneath something that is very high, you will have the courts flooded with meritorious applications, which do not fall in line with our system of justice that is governed, once again, by prosecutorial discretion. So in selective prosecution applications and motions, you really have to prove that there is some intentional discrimination. You have to prove that statistically folks that commit crimes, such as the crimes you are charged with, are not prosecuted, right? That is extremely difficult to prove. You have to prove that a prosecutor is going after you on purpose because that prosecutor effectively doesn't like you. And when you balance that with prosecutorial discretion, it's a very hard standard to meet. It's a very high standard to meet, right? The remedy is, well, we have something called the adversarial system of justice. Every defendant is afforded a lawyer, and that lawyer has to fight on behalf of that defendant to make sure that the defendant's theories of defense, the defendant's defenses, essentially, are shown to a jury, to a judge at some point in the system. And that's fine, right? It becomes difficult when you balance that with the resources the government has. No defendant, irrespective of how rich that defendant is or how influential or powerful that defendant is, and we've seen these cases, will have as much available to him or her as the government on any level, right? So again, prosecutorial discretion is the rule that governs criminal prosecutions in this country by and large. And it's very hard to prove a political prosecution. It's very hard to prove that a prosecution is motivated by politics for that reason, right? Our system of justice is designed to rely on prosecutors, to rely on their good faith, to rely on their honesty, to rely on their integrity. And most prosecutors are honest and do operate with integrity and do operate within the law, right, as they should. And most prosecutors are good people, honest, hardworking people that do a good job to serve the public, right? So political prosecutions are something that we are really afraid of here in the States, and that is why, and we should be.